Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bonjour, buenos dias. Welcome to day 2 of the Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress 2025. I'm very pleased to welcome you all back today to this session. My name is Karen McDonald-Yale, and I am the Chief Executive Officer for the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. And my job today is very simple: to welcome you all back. Yesterday's session on our theme of conservation outcomes through regional action and leverage, or CORAL, because we love acronyms, was amazing. We had a range of panelists from across the globe speaking about the value of conservation trust funds and speaking about what is best suited for small island developing states and also for the Caribbean region. And that really is the aim of our discussions and this Congress, to think about what makes sense for the Caribbean. And that's a theme we will continue today. We have sessions that will discuss what blue carbon means in the Caribbean, what debt nature swaps look like in the Caribbean today. We have some experience that we've been hearing about in the news, and we have some of the partners to give us the lowdown on how well it's been working and what the challenges are. And then we have some other sessions on climate financing and conservation. I'm going to hand over to your moderator, Tadja Bervoets, who is the project lead for the CBF Blue Economy Financing Project and a technical officer at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. I do have a couple of housekeeping notes that we want to just make sure you know. There is translation available for those who are English or Spanish speakers or prefer to listen in English or Spanish. There is a Q&A box, which we really encourage you to use. And as I see already happening, we encourage you to use the chat to add your contacts and information. We also want to note that we are using Zoom events. And so after this session and for the other sessions, that lobby where you saw the list of all the sessions will come up, and the next event would be accessible for there. But we will tell you more about that at the end. With that, I'm very, very pleased to welcome our moderator, Tadja Bervoets, to be able to give you the proper greeting and introduce you to our guest speaker for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your introduction. And good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this morning's session of the Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you and to moderate this important conversation on blue economy and conservation finance, which is an area of growing urgency and opportunity for our region. Again, although Karen did a great introduction of me, thank you so much, Karen. But again, my name is Tadja Bervoets, and I serve as the technical officer at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, where I lead the Bluefin project, which is being executed by us here at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, implemented by the United Nations Environment Program with funding from the Global Environment Facility, or GEF, who we received some excellent interventions and information from yesterday. Just a bit of a background on the Bluefin project. The Bluefin project is focused on strengthening nature-based economy approaches and developing innovative financing mechanisms to unlock sustainable investment in marine and coastal ecosystems across 5 Caribbean countries: so the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada. And we're trying to do this through initiatives such as a regional blue economy hub, credit and insurance-based financial instruments, and for the purposes of our discussion and presentation here today, developing out blue carbon facility for initially the 5 project countries, but definitely scaling it up throughout the region. But we're also focusing on what I think is very important, public-private partnerships, and developing out, how we involve the public and private sector in developing out the sustainable blue economy for the region. And Bluefin project specifically aims to create long-term environmental and socio-economic impacts across our region. Again, just to reiterate what Karen already mentioned, in terms of a quick housekeeping note, simultaneous translation is available for this session. So please do make use of it as needed. and you can do so using the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and selecting the language of your choice for simultaneous translation. So now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Edwards. Dr. Edwards supports Pew's environmental programs with a focus on conservation economics, marine science, and environmental policy. His expertise spans natural resource economic valuation, blue carbon, marine policy, and socioeconomic monitoring. Prior to his role at Pew, he served at NOAA, where he led work on blue carbon ecosystems and socioeconomic monitoring of communities connected to the US coral reef ecosystem. Dr. Edwards holds a degree in zoology and marine sciences from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and a PhD in marine studies from the University of Delaware. This is the first time hearing Dr. Edwards speak. You are in for a real treat. But before we get to that, following Dr. Edwards' presentation, we will of course open the floor for a question and answer session. And we do have a decent chunk of time available for that. So definitely don't be shy and ask any questions that you may have. And for doing so, we encourage you to please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. And of course, we encourage an interactive dialogue, and we'd love to hear your reflections on how the themes presented resonate with your work across the region. So having said that, and without taking any more of Dr. Edwards' time, Peter, the floor is yours.
Morning. Bonjour. Buenos dias, todos. I'm trying to organize my screen here. Thank you, Tadia, for that warm introduction. I'm glad to participate in the session today, and thanks also to my good friend Karen for setting up this conversation. And as Tadio highlighted, my hope here today is to focus on blue carbon financing and blue carbon considerations. Again, it is a pleasure to be here. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So let's get into it. Let me set my timer so I keep on task. So we have a lot of time for Q&A. So just today, I'll be just presenting on generally in the growing opportunities for the role of blue carbon in supporting climate and economic resilience across the Caribbean. This includes the finance, science, and policy aspects. So just a quick familiarization. I am sure we have a broad suite of persons on the line here on the conference today, but a quick familiarization with particularly these three IPCC or Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change blue carbon ecosystems. We all know that they play a very key role in carbon sequestration, including these three particular ecosystems, noting as well that there are other ecosystems out there like macroalgae, sargassum, kelp, and so on that play a role. But a lot of the focus, and in fact, the term blue carbon was really designed around coastal blue carbon ecosystems. I also want to also pay a special mention that while coral reefs are not necessarily a blue carbon ecosystem in a classic term, they are often associated with these ecosystems. And in many instances, without a coral reef being there, you wouldn't have these ecosystems thriving. So just want to make a special note of that. And of course, the role that coral reefs and beaches play in the blue economy, certainly in our region, cannot be understated. And finally, just a really quick note that while this term blue carbon is really usually associated with coastal ecosystems, the ocean itself is big blue, and it's really the driver of all things. And so it's, it also is currently presenting some opportunities for economic opportunities, which come with some opportunities and risks. And I'll be discussing that in a while. So to reiterate, blue carbon is really depending on who you're asking and on what their interests are. And you'll be hearing a constant theme throughout this presentation today that it really is more than just the carbon. Blue economy is also a term that this session and the ones that follow, it's really going to be dedicated to it. But the definitions, as you usually hear them, really generally speak to this idea of leveraging ocean resources for economic benefits, while at the same time ensuring sustainability. So one of the messages that I also want to leave is that blue economy and anything around it needs to be grounded in sustainable ecological use. We need to be very mindful of repeating, the old extractive approaches to the blue economy. For example, overfishing, for example, unsustainable cruise shipping, the way we do our coastal tourism. So blue economy really, when you attach the word blue to it, I want the branding to be around sustainable use, and let's just expand into the ocean and do more of the same old. So why does blue carbon matter? As we mentioned before, these ecosystems that we're usually focused on are very efficient at capturing carbon dioxide. But beyond these climate benefits, there are these co-benefits. And and many of us might be in the room familiar with these concepts. Fisheries, they provide important roles at protecting coastlines against storms. And if you notice the thread here and the examples highlighted here, they really play a key role in economic and social resilience, and particularly to small island developing states and also countries in the Caribbean region, including folks on the larger continents. So therefore, as we all know, they're very vital for both mitigation and adaptation. I want to just zero in a bit on certainly 3 ecosystem services, or otherwise known as nature's benefits. If some of you might be familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment categories, regulating ecosystem services, provisioning ecosystem services, and cultural ecosystem services, all highlighted here. They're directly and also indirectly linked to economies and community resilience. I want to also play a special mention for the role that mangroves and peatlands and other coastal wetland ecosystems play in maintaining freshwater reserves, the role that they play in minimizing saltwater intrusion, buffering against sea level rise, because very often we tend to focus on the obvious carbon sequestration role as well as the coastal protection, but sometimes we also need to be reminded that they also play a key role in kind of maintaining water security. But obviously the examples shown here again reinforce the importance and the economic importance of these ecosystems to the region. I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about the work that my organization, the Pew Charitable Trust, and in particular the work of the International Coastal Wetlands team that I support as well. Our work at Pew is really grounded in helping countries and helping our partner countries think through ways to include coastal wetlands and blue carbon coastal wetlands ecosystems in their nationally determined contributions. And let me slow down so hopefully the interpreters can catch up with me. Our work is centered around in-country partnerships, so it's really partner-driven, and we work with normally non-governmental partners, both academic as well as NGO environmental groups, to help our partners in the country work on and help them include and incorporate these ecosystems formally into particularly in their updates to their nationally determined contributions. These are active partnerships, and we provide a range of support, technical as well as policy. And our goal is to really strengthen local capacities to improve the incorporation of these ecosystems into national development priorities. And of course, when you incorporate these in mechanisms for protection and mapping and so on into countries' commitments, you often have to think about financing. So financing is an element of that we try to see if we can move forward as well. So it really dovetails into this session today. Where are we working? For broader context, we work both in the Western Indian Ocean region, starting on our first phase with Seychelles and then moving on to working in Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and a regional seagrass mapping project that includes Madagascar. But more germane to our region, we started out with our pilot projects or proof of concept projects in Belize and Costa Rica. And I know you'll be hearing from some of our partners in the following session, who we work closely with on some of these topics in Belize, certainly. And we also now work in Jamaica, where I'm from originally, and Honduras and Panama. So this is the spread of the blue carbon policy work that includes some financing context that I wanted to just briefly talk about here. So this slide is familiar to everyone. The coastal ecosystems, including these blue carbon ones that we're talking about, is deeply important. We're dependent and also vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the ocean and climate change impacts and so on. And because there's so much economic activity along our coast, it is essential to protect and also support the financing of these ecosystems so that they continue to provide these benefits to us. There's also untapped potential new innovations out there, including use of blue carbon ecosystems in financing. And I will also touch on, opportunities further offshore in the deeper ocean. So really zeroing in, and I really, this is a high level expose into the topic because I know you're going to be delving more deeply into these topics in further sessions, but obviously, blue carbon and the carbon that's in the term blue carbon is really linked to how are we leveraging the carbon ecosystem services that these ecosystems provide. So listed on this page are approaches and finance approaches that many might be familiar. First of all is voluntary carbon credits. And, as described here, we are trying to roll it out in certain places. I know there's a recent announcement in the Bahamas, and I know there's other interest, both national and regional as well. But again, my role as an economist and also as a marine scientist is that we need to recognize that these approaches need to be done properly. It requires the support of better data, sound governance structures, and policy alignment. For example, we need to ensure that we have information on land tenure, both private and public. We need to include the science and the policy requirements so that we can ensure that monitoring, reporting, and verification MRV is sound. And so I know globally as well as in the region, we're still working on this issue, which is why these approaches are limited in scale so far. But again, my goal is that we need to get all of those things right before we run ahead and find ourselves in trouble. Also noted that there are blended approaches that are emerging now that attempt to combine carbon with the co-benefits that I mentioned before, including biodiversity credits and resilience credits. Again, these are nascent in their development, and we again need to pay special attention, particularly with the biodiversity credits, since figuring out what a unit of biodiversity is still new. But again, these are good innovative approaches that need to be tested, but we just need to be mindful of some of the pitfalls if we run too far ahead with some of these things. Again, this slide, you guys are going to be talking later today in more detail about some of these topics, blue bonds, for example, but there are a full suite of financing opportunities, some of them more market-based and some of them linked to government levies and taxes, and obviously continued bilateral and overseas development assistance and so on. A whole range that have application to blue carbon and coastal blue carbon ecosystems in particular. Again, I know our friends from the Bahamas and Belize and Barbados in this region are very familiar with things like debt for nature swaps and blue bonds. So again, all of these approaches are familiar to us. Very often they're mostly associated with, coastal management and MP and fisheries focus. But obviously, given the role that these blue carbon ecosystems play, they're often part of the package. So again, not going to be spending too much time delving into this, but just highlighting that these are innovative financing pathways that certainly the CBF and the work that TADSO is promoting as well are trying to work on. I just want to spend a few moments on an emerging topic that's popping up elsewhere and starting to to pop up in our region as well is this concept of marine carbon dioxide removal. And this slide here is a quick snapshot on the different types of approaches that I'm talking about. We are, there's a range of approaches, and what I just highlighted, we're very familiar with the more nature-based approach, kind of in that left-hand corner of the slide, blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves, like seagrasses, like macroalgae. But what I also wanted to highlight are some other emerging approaches, such as the approaches that require active and consistent human interventions to try and enhance carbon dioxide removal. These are popping up, and they're a mixture of public and private, or private and university-led initiatives and pilot sectors. Exciting new, and there's huge potential to increase drawdown for carbon dioxide, but these exciting opportunities come with risks. Just want to quickly mention one that many of us are familiar with in this region in terms of sargassum. And on the, the provisioning side, there are lots of opportunities to take these things. And I know there's lots of work going on about using it in agriculture and, part of incorporating it into other land-based opportunities. But there's also an effort to see if we can, if they can use these to generate carbon credits by taking them out to sea and sinking them. Again, this is a new area. We continue to press that we need protocols, and there are still lots of gaps in the monitoring, reporting, and verification that ensure additionality. So while these things move ahead and we should keep testing, we need to be cautious as we move ahead with this. The other one of that full suite that I showed, I want to quickly mention, is ocean alkalinity enhancement. Lots of pilots and trials are happening elsewhere, a lot of it happening in OECD countries, in Europe, as well as North America. However, there's interest, obviously, looking to the Caribbean region, and this is, as the slide describes, where you're adding substances to seawater, very often taking geologic substances and trying to enhance CO2 absorption. Huge promise and potential for actually enhancing carbon dioxide drawdown. However, there are lots of risks that we need to be mindful of. So quickly, last few slides here, an overview, and some of this may sound very familiar to folks in this panel today, is that we need to think regionally about how we're aligning blue carbon policy into our NDCs and including blue economy considerations. We need to look carefully at some of the pilot projects, whether they're in the MCDR space or ocean carbon dioxide removal space, or classic continued blue carbon restoration potential, which is where carbon markets opportunity lie. You have to restore before you can claim credits in terms of additionality. Obviously, looking at other things like mariculture and aquaculture and so on, and the role that adaptation projects play. Capacity building is key. We need to invest in all of the science and technology needed to support the monitoring and reporting aspects, especially if we're thinking about carbon accounting and regulatory frameworks. And again, as the work that CBF and others are doing, these public-private partnerships are key. All of the success, all of this, and it, all is not lost. I think, we're a very interesting and important space. But I just want to reiterate that the success factors rely on these things shown on the screen here. Benefit sharing is key, equitable benefit sharing. We don't want to repeat the mistakes in other places. If you're going to be creating a carbon project, you're making sure that you're not displacing people who formerly had prescriptive rights to these resources. We need to ensure that we're safeguarding both ecosystems and communities. Regional collaboration, we are small archipelagic states, many of us, but as a unit, we have better bargaining power. So if we're standardizing our approach, including that policy harmonization I mentioned before, this will allow us being better able to access global markets potentially in terms of climate funding and so on. I'm not going to read all the things on this slide, but I'll give you a moment to read them for yourself. But there are lots of opportunities that I mentioned before, but also these opportunities come with risks. And embedded in these risks that we need to make sure is that we are making sure that what we say we're doing is actually happening. When we spend money on blue carbon related management or blue carbon related financing, we have to make sure that what we say we hope to get is actually happening on the ground. We also need to make sure that we're preventing risks from happening, and equity, always embedded. I just want to quickly mention two resources that really go into kind of highlight in a little bit more detail some of what I discussed today. The one on the left, the Blue Carbon Ecosystem Supplement, is something that myself and other colleagues at Pew developed recently with our partners at the NDC partnership. It really goes into climate investment planning and mobilization frameworks. It's designed for policymakers and particularly government personnel and others, and gives this full suite of blue carbon ecosystems financing opportunities. It's not focused primarily on carbon markets. It gives a full suite, both private sector market-based approaches as well as other mechanisms. So I have a link there, but feel free to Google it. You should be able to find it. Another one that I have nothing to do with it, but saw recently was developed by our friends in Conservation International and RARE. And again, their focus is explicit. It's beyond market approaches. They go into other ways to think about financing and conservation, market-based and economics that are not necessarily driven by carbon markets. Also very important, as again, a diversified portfolio of financing opportunities is what you need to approach this problem. So 2 last slides, I promise you. Blue carbon offers these, fast, effective carbon removal and vital adaptation services, which are linked to financing opportunities, which are linked to these co-benefits that actually provide tangible and real economic benefits to people. Because, carbon is this ubiquitous substance that you can't necessarily see, but the adaptation services, the provisioning services, as mentioned before, is what is important. So, and again, we need to also be mindful of the newfangled things that are coming through. They have great potential, but they also come with risks, so we need to be careful and we need to think through durability. Lastly, I want to reiterate, blue carbon is really, again, more than just the carbon. And I think most of us in this room understand this. And so I want us, while we're thinking about the carbon and an important climate role and the financing aspects that come along with it, the co-benefits are really what drive some of the real tangible opportunities that we can see. There are obviously, ecosystem services, a whole suite of them that are linked to these carbon benefits. And lastly, again, while we're delving into this new world of blue economy and diversified blue economy financing, making sure that we're not perpetuating some of the old extractive behaviors that we're familiar with, certainly in this region. So with that, I would like to end and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, for that excellent and comprehensive presentation. A few key takeaways stood out for me especially. Really what struck home for me is the message that blue carbon is more than just about carbon. So the emphasis on the interconnectivity of ecosystems and also the central role of the ocean as a fundamental driver of life and opportunity in our region, I think was a very powerful reminder of what's at stake. And also the notion that the blue economy must be firmly rooted in sustainable use, both in terms of practice and in terms of branding, I think is especially timely. Also, your points on incorporating ecosystems into nationally determined contributions were particularly compelling, especially with regard to sort of the broader discussion on climate financing. And then, of course, the call to strengthen our approaches by recognizing ecosystem services within sort of our national and also our regional NDC frameworks and securing adequate conservation financing, I think you highlighted as being a critical point. I think you also captured the duality of our relationship with the ocean, which is something that I think is a real consideration for our region, our profound dependence on the sea that surrounds us, on the Caribbean Sea, but also our increasing vulnerability to the changes that happen in our ocean space. And I think that makes the push for sound governance structure, strong data, and policy alignment all the more urgent, especially given the complexity of the MRV process. And then sort of lastly, I was also intrigued by the exploration of marine carbon dioxide removal. And what was new for me, the emerging approaches like ocean alkalinity enhancement, which I think is promising, but of course also requires some robust protocols. And then using it as a good segue into some of our questions, I'm very happy to see that the audience has already starting to be engaged and has already starting to ask questions in the chat. And again, we encourage all of the participants to ask your questions in the chat, but especially the discussions, which I think are very timely around sargassum, not only as a regional challenge, but also as a potential opportunity, and raising some of the important considerations for how we design protocols and track the outcomes. So thank you again for the insights and clarity you brought to these interconnected issues. And again, I'm so very happy to see that there are already quite a bit of questions coming in on the chat. So I will just take them in the order of how they were asked.
And I'll see if I can answer, because some of them are beyond me, and I know we're going to dig. The sessions will dig into some of these somewhere, but we can have a chat to see.
Sure. And we have the time. So again, I encourage everyone to ask the Q&A in the boxes. Peter just to confirm that you can also see the questions.
Yes, I managed to bring it up, which is why if you see me
right.
looking this side, I'm looking at the Q&A.
All right, great. So yeah, let's just take them in order of the way that they were asked. So we will start with the anonymous attendee. Is there a market for microalgae in the Caribbean?
And hopefully folks are in the chat who are more expert on some of these. Feel free to insert corrections or additions. But I think, I guess the microalgae, perhaps they probably meant macroalgae, which is things like seaweed. So again, a whole range of macroalgae species, right? And so the market pieces are different. I know that there's lots of a long history of use of macroalgae, like gracilia or seaweed, sea moss, and its use in food and so on. So I think there's opportunities for using those products sustainably, expanding and exposing more of our Caribbean people to the use of those things and growth of those things. I think the other market piece is the role that sargassum, and obviously I know Tajo and others, you work very closely with it, and it's impacting our coastal region, impacting our tourism product. And so thinking through some of these innovative approaches into removing them sustainably from the shorelines and reincorporating them into agriculture and so on. I know there are some challenges because the sargassum tends to hold some nasty stuff as well, like arsenic and so on. However, the other piece, which I know is also happening in the region, is a potential market for using the removal and sinking of sargassum as a way to demonstrate that you're removing extra carbon out of the atmosphere. That is something that I know is happening. I don't have much technical details on it, but that's also what I mentioned, that it's nascent and we need to be careful about the credit aspect of it. I think there are probably other ways to package it to do the environmental good that it's doing. But the credit piece and making sure that you're actually getting the benefits of it and they're not just kind of like rotting and returning carbon to the atmosphere, you have to be careful. But that's on the macroalgae style side. But I think broadly speaking, just mariculture in general, even using sessile organisms in combination with these blue carbon ecosystems, like pairing oyster growth with mangroves as a way to make sure that you still have mangroves. There are a range of coastal economic, mariculture, the growth of things in the ocean that we can explore. And I'm sure the Blue Economy Facility is probably looking at some of these things.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Some of that bled into the second question, which is what's the greatest potential for smelly and unsightly. again, I'm not the expert here. I think personally, kind of really looking at its use and incorporation into the soil, into building our soils, into agriculture and so on, might be one of the most direct ways, but also its use in biochar, because using it as a almost a additive for agriculture, I think that probably has the most promise.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you so much for sort of the first questions to kick us off. George Cummings had a question related to a link on resilient credits, please. And I think one of the products coming out of these sessions, or coming out of the Conservation Finance Congress in general, is that we will share as many resources as we can coming out of these sessions. So most certainly we will share as much as we can, and we'll be leaning on Dr. Edwards in terms of providing some of those resources so that we can share them after these sessions. So the next question.
What I will say about resilience credits is it's under development, and I know there are folks in certainly organizations who are looking at the potential, and also some of the more well-known carbon crediting mechanisms like Vera. I know Vera is working on developing a resilience credits. It's not quite there yet. They're still working on it. So but again, it's a way to shift the focus on the carbon piece and more kind of adaptation and other kind of co-benefits. I'm trying to find ways to come up with a credit scheme, again, making sure that you can, make sure it's permanent, there's additionality and so on. So it's a well-worthy space to explore, but it's still under development in many places.
Great, thank you, Peter. As with so many things in this particular space, because it's so nascent, I think there's quite a bit of development that still needs to happen. The next question is actually from our CEO at CBF, Karen McDonald-Gale, via Angelica Shamarina. Thank you so much, Angelica. Karen is asking, do we have actual numbers? Have there been any payouts for blue carbon credits? Any dollar values? Any of those? Did any of those happen in small and in developing states? And was there or will there be a return on investment for the payout on the profit?
And I can count on my good friend Karen to ask me the hard questions that I cannot answer. It's a great question. I think I think I may have quickly mentioned in my slide that they're very small examples, and I'm sure they must be at a very granular scale, more kind of social investment, carbon offset type schemes, but I don't know of any significant carbon credit project. I'm sure there are, and I think I saw a couple of weeks ago that something was rolled out in the Bahamas, and I'm not sure exactly of the kind of how technical and how sound it is, but that's the issue, right? We don't have enough numbers. And also I think some of Karen's question is pointing to the return on investment. Who gets these benefits? Where do the benefits go? But I can't really answer that. I don't think we have enough of them to give us a sense of where we are, certainly in our region.
Thank you, Peter. I had some issues finding my unmute button, but thank you so much. Yes, and totally agree. Our next question is from my fellow St. Martinist, Star Peterson, who's asking, can we briefly touch on depth for nature swaps for the new guys in the room? But I see that there has already been an answer in the chat at the session coming up at 10. And of course, we do encourage all of the participants that are joining us for this morning session to also join us for the next session, where we will be talking specifically about depth for nature swaps and some of those other financial mechanisms. So Star, if you're able to, please stick around as much as you can to join the other sessions so that we can educate some of the new guys on depth for nature swaps. And trust me, it's not only related to the new guys, even the guys that are that have been involved in this space, where we also are still wrapping our mind around how those mechanisms work for the region.
Yes, and I see in the upcoming panel my good friends, Dr. Leandra Tro and Ms. Beverly Wade, and some of those folks are far more experienced on debt for nature swaps and blue bonds than I am. So I think this is really a good, yesterday was great, but your day 2 sessions are looking very, very good as well.
Thank you. Excellent.
And I see a question about posting the link. I'm assuming a PDF version of this presentation is, I'm assuming it's fine to share after this. So that's fine. And I think embedded in the presentation are some links to some of the resources that I mentioned.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Chelsea K. Are there examples of simplified but effective MRV systems that we're able to share? Simplified in terms of technical processes and less resource intensive to implement.
And that I can't pull out of my hat, but I think the challenge with proper and sound monitoring, reporting, and verification systems is that they definitely require certain upfront resources to get yourselves in place. You need to have the baseline information. And if we're thinking about things like carbon markets, you need information on, habitat status, for example. What's the status of the mangroves or seagrasses, but mostly mangroves? What's the likely threat? And then, of course, with carbon markets, the point is you have to show, okay, we're going to do an intervention, and based on that intervention, we are now additionally removing extra carbon dioxide. So you have to be able to measure or model how much extra carbon dioxide that you're pulling out from the air. And you also have to demonstrate that because of your policy and your management and your the technology that you use to do it, that it's more or less permanent. And that permanence can be from 25 years to 100 years. And once you establish all of those things is when you're supposed to be able to show to the markets that you can get potentially carbon credits in this instance from this. So there's a whole suite of things that rely on some baseline information that will require technical support, whether the domestic or the project developer phase, monitoring, during the process, and obviously, afterwards to make sure that you're actually giving the value for money. So the short answer is the process is not simple and it is highly technical. I think what will make it less resource intensive is a focus, and I think I briefly touched on it, on some of that baseline information. And this is where partnerships between universities and government to have a handle on what you have, where it is, what are the likely threats. And obviously, certainly for blue carbon, we're talking about measuring carbon below ground and above ground. So you have actually a snapshot, and then depending on your restoration or rehabilitation potential, what's that likely going to do to increase more carbon being removed? All of those things aren't simple. So I'm sorry to say that I guess you could say they're simple approaches and effective, but they don't come cheap. The other thing I'll say again, I know that some of our colleagues in the Caribbean, certainly out of the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, are using other technologies like LiDAR, radar technology for measuring and so on. So there are a blend of technology and kind of in-field approaches that are being piloted and worked on. I know the IDB is supporting some work in the region. So that might be a resource that could provide some more information.
Awesome, thank you, Peter. Karen also mentioned, which I think is worth repeating during the session, that at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, we would like to acknowledge that we are also working with regional partners, including the Nature Conservancy, University of the West Indies, to effectively map a range of blue economy information, including the potential for blue carbon. And there is more to be shared soon. And then also, as a note to all participants, we will be uploading Dr. Edwards' presentation as a resource here in this session. So we are going to ask if you are interested in that to please download it. And I've just been updated that it has already been uploaded. I'm also happy to see that we have another representative or another participant from St. Martin. Happy to shout out my St. Martin Massive. Thank you so much for joining. This question is from Rudy Samtani. What foundational actions should Caribbean governments prioritize now to position themselves for future participation in blue carbon finance mechanism?
Good question, and Tazi, you must have had all your friends in St. Martin. So come on, make sure you ask Dr. Edwards some hard questions. But
I think
I think I spoke to that before, but I'll happy to repeat it again. I think some of those high level standardized approaches are important. We want, as a region, to be standardized in our approach. So and mainstreaming things like including these ecosystems in our mitigation climate policy, so in the NDCs, and of course, yesterday I know we had a session on the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, so the NBSAPs, as well as the National Adaptation Planning. So at that level, you know, and what those foundational actions are, again, are knowing how much you have in all the different ways, so spatial information, on-the-ground information, and underground information, because if you're talking about carbon, you're talking about knowing how much carbon is being stored in the ground. So foundational kind of science and mapping and inventory type actions. I think some other foundational activities include policy harmonization. Here are the ministries of environment, Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Water, Fisheries sometimes that have seagrass responsibility. Are they talking with, or the right people in the ministry is talking with the people in the Ministry of Finance, which also linked with the banking sector and so on. So I think some of those kind of policy harmonization, again, which is linked to these, it's boring, but it's very important, national policy level frameworks are key. Foundational to that, obviously, is, you know, informing and educating our young and not so young persons to be able to participate in this process. So our scientists, you know, I started out as a coastal ecologist. Scientists who might be working in a lab somewhere wondering, what am I going to be doing with this? Are we finding ways to incorporate these young people into this monitoring, into this stuff? Are we training our young lawyers to be dealing with, you know, international trade policy and so on? So a lot of, you know, again, it might sound very lofty, but again, foundational, right? You have to educate the populations of the region to meet the needs of the moment. So I think some of those key things, knowing what you have, knowing how much is there, so to be able to have a status quo, and also part of your planning, what kind of restoration or restorative information is going to be needed. I think even some technical things, transferable skills like construction. Are we leveraging the skills of engineering and construction to rehabilitate these coastal ecosystems? This blue-gray infrastructure work, natural infrastructure. I think some of those are some of the kind of foundational activities that folks need to be thinking of when we're addressing these challenges.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think the mention of involving youth, I think that resonated particularly with Rudy. So thank you so much for your question, Rudy. Before I go on to the next question, just I would like to mention that on the lower section of the Zoom app to the right, you should be able to see the resources tab where you can download informative documents regarding the event, also of CBF and its partner organizations. And that's also where Dr. Edwards' presentation has been uploaded. So as a form of instruction, download Dr. Peter's presentation using the resources tab next to the Q&A box. So indeed, next to the Q&A box, there is a resources tab. For me, it's to the left. It might be different for the other folks on the session, but that's where you'll be able to access some of the resources. Down to the next question, and I'm very grateful that there's such active engagement on this session, and I think the presence of Dr. Edwards has a lot to do with that. But the question from Nayan Lindo is: we each seem to be used to doing our own thing. We do collaborate, but sometimes the collaboration seems secondary to our individual efforts. What is the most vital step that the region can take now to achieve real collaboration and synergy?
Well, these are some lofty questions, and we try and
I
get
know, Peter. But you're doing it good. You're answering them though, so don't worry.
Good questions. I'm probably, best over a lime with a beer or a rum in my hand. But but it's a good question. I think I
5 o'clock somewhere, Peter.
alluded to that as well in the presentation about the need for kind of collective effort across all the boundaries. And I'm probably going to kind of blend the question that follows about the fact that some of our countries in our region are still overseas territories, but we are bounded by the same ocean, and we share these borders together. So I think opportunities, and even though this is virtual, I think peer-to-peer exchanges, peer-to-peer learning amongst ourselves, so sharing what is happening. And I love that the focus is, even though I'm based in the United States now, that a lot of the conversation here is being driven by us, people in our region. So I think continue to doing things like this, and it may sound very simple, but peer-to-peer exchanges are very powerful. Sharing what you're learning, how you're dealing with, how you manage to, write your JEF proposal to get funding. All of those things are very important to show that we're not alone, right? So I think just finding spaces, whether it's virtual, digital, to continue collaborating. I think the project that you lead, Tadzo, and you're piloting in these different islands, that forces that collaboration, right? So you have activities in a number of islands, different geographies, different contexts, but you're trying to roll out efforts and learn from each other. So I think it might be modular, but I think that's the kind of more powerful and fundamental approach to including this collaboration. And again, because I'm a scientist, collecting that information, being able to package it, and also, again, certainly with the blue carbon and biodiversity space, knowing what we have, knowing how much of it we have, and the threats, where is it going down, is it going up, I think, and sharing that, because again, sometimes we think we're just dealing with things on our own. Then I think that's powerful. And so I think, the finance piece, which is what the other question that Didi is asking, that's a challenge, right? I think, Tadzo, you are probably aware that, in the past, and other organizations that have been associated with, sometimes we have funding dedicated to, a particular activity, and it's only eligible for certain folks. But if you can be creative to invite others to kind of learn, peer-to-peer learning and exchanges, there are ways around these things. Again, we're bounded by these geographies. The finance aspects obviously is kind of tricky, right? So unless you're moving funding to non-governmental organizations through some kind of coordinated mechanism, that's potentially a way that could work. But again, I'm not an expert in that. But I think just starting with peer-to-peer learning and exchanges and opportunities to leverage what's happening out there are ways to go to break down the broader regional barrier, including the institutional barriers of, overseas territories versus independent.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. And yes, indeed, one of the things that we're also looking at within the context of the Bluefin project is recognizing that, especially for blue carbon ecosystems, scale is a consideration. So one of the things that we're also looking at, especially for some of the smaller islands in the Eastern Caribbean, is grouping some of those ecosystems as we sort of develop out how we will pilot a blue carbon facility for some of the smaller islands. And I also would like to mention what Karen also mentioned during the chat, is to think outside of the box, that it would be great for the Caribbean to coordinate our blue economy policy processes, and especially as this may be useful. And I also would like to acknowledge that, again, another person from St. Martin, Didi Johnson, has asked a question regarding some of the complexities related to setting up a blue carbon scheme, especially from countries or territories that still belong to, and I'm choosing my words carefully, to a larger constitutional framework. So especially in the case of St. Martin, we are overseas country and territory of the European Union. We are part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, so there are some complexities in rolling out sort of these not only blue carbon, but especially climate change related initiatives separate from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but that is a whole different conversation. But it is something that that requires some focus, especially for the OCT countries that are based in the Caribbean region.
And I know we have about 5 minutes left, so I see two more questions. So
we have 2 more questions. I'm very happy that we have such active engagement. So very quickly, Peter, the ocean-based carbon removal projects in concept are being tested. And then we have 1 more question after this. And I do suggest that we keep it to that last question, and then we wrap up the session. So Peter, if you can very briefly answer the first question, and then we'll tackle briefly also the question from Hans.
Sure. So the ocean-based carbon removal projects, and there are a range of them, right? I have that slide with a whole different types of approaches. Many of them are happening in pilots in different places. Many of them in North America, both US coast, East and West Coast. Many of them in Canada as well, East and West of Canada, and some of them in Europe. And because of the international regulations, they all are kind of at research and pilot scale. So some of them are being rolled out, some of the ocean alkalinity, some macroalgal stuff. So they're happening and being tested. And I know some of the folks involved in it are interested in seeing if there are opportunities in the Caribbean, which is why I said we need to be ready to meet that. The cash flow question, that's what I nodded to. And I know that the folks in the next coming session will deal with that in more detail, is that transparency piece, right? That equity piece. Like, if you set up these deals, well, especially if they're private kind of funding mechanisms and designed for market-based mechanisms, and that's key. Making sure that these benefits, some of them actually flow to the people who are on the ground and that matter. And that's a fundamental thing that's across, even in, development financing or conservation financing writ large, just like grant funding. It's transparency is key. So I think I'll stop there since we have about 4 minutes. And I know you'll be probably dealing with a lot of these questions in a more fulsome way in the sessions to follow.
Sure. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you, everyone that participated this morning for your active engagement. Thank you again, Dr. Edwards, for your presentation. I think it was very informative, especially gauging by the amount of questions and interaction we had with the audience. So thank you again so much for taking time out of what we know is your busy schedule to be able to enlighten us today on blue carbon and some of the considerations that we have in the region. I wish everyone a great rest of the session. And of course, we encourage you to join all of the sessions that we have scheduled for today. And please remember to go to the sessions tab on the Zoom events platform so you can go to the next session that is starting promptly at 10 a.m. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, and it was a great pleasure to be able to moderate today. Thank you very much.